Here is we're continuing to chapter 3. In the Zoom Shiur last night, we did 2 and 3. I just made it broken down from 2 and 3 for today. So today is part 2 of the recording of lessons in Kuntres Heichaltzu. It's a treatise on Ahavas Yisroel by the Rebbe Rashab. Okay, let's go to the summary and the introduction. So the summary of the last chapter was the intent of the reason for going to war against Midian, that it was for revenge and not conquest. It wasn't one of the original lands promised to us. It was the opposition to God's name Havaya, and there was a whole thing about the nation of Israel is the apple of God's eye, and if you go and attack the Jewish people, you're attacking Hashem directly. Then there was questions on the language used in the Torah, which implies that the war against Midian was to be fought by the entire Jewish people. Now, introduction to chapter 3 of lessons in Kuntres Heichaltzu. In the preceding chapters, the Rebbe Rashab raised several questions concerning God's command to Moshe to wage war against Midian. In this chapter, it explains the explanation of the Hasidic concepts behind the command, including the idea that Midian is identified with the strife and disunity. In general terms, the concept can be explained as follows. The name Midian shares the same root letters as the word Madin, which means strife and contention. The fundamental characteristics of the klipa of Midian is separation and division. In a personal sense, this refers to baseless hatred and disunity that exists in people's hearts. So the name Midian means strife, and they're connected to the idea of selfishness and division. This is the direct opposite of the side of holiness, which is characterized by unity, achdus. This is, as well known, the principal difference between holiness and sitra achra, between kedusha and sitra achra. Holiness, kedusha, which is called holiness, is characterized by unification, achdus. This enables us to appreciate the uniqueness of God's name Havaya and the fundamental oneness that it brings about. This oneness is expressed through the unity and synthesis of the attributes of the intellect and emotive qualities as they exist in the realm of holiness. Although there are 10 distinct spheros comprising both mochin, the intellectual attributes, and midos, emotive attributes, they are nevertheless unified and combined in perfect harmony. See, by the 10 spheros, everything's connected to the next sphero, and it's a chaining down, and there's complete unity. Basically, with 10 spheros, Hashem, to create the world and for it to be stable, he didn't put all of his energy on one object because it wouldn't be able to sustain Hashem's energy. So Hashem would make a chain down reaction called the spheros hakelim, where like one malach he'd create one malach, or one spiritual world, and it would have all the 7 midos, and then it would chain down to the next world, and it would change down to the next level, and it would all be within harmony and unification, everything at the right measure, so that everything would be able to be contained. And then when it goes all the way down to this physical world, the world of action, Asiya, the revelation of God is further away from everything else. But nevertheless, they're in perfect harmony for the world to be created. The spheres represent God's intellectual and emotive attributes. We just said that. Okay, the influence of God's name Havaya. It combines and unifies the spheres in absolute oneness, which each one to appreciate how another can complement it. So if you have chesed, it can have gevura with it, without it being a contradiction. It can add tiferes, hod, yesod, Malchus, they could all be intermingled within each other without being destroyed. Because they all have bittul, they all have humility. There's room for another spirit to exist beside it. In contrast, the source and distinguishing trait of klipa, the unholiness, is the opposite. It is specifically separation and division. Yaakov declared, I have choil, I have all, a term which implies hiskalus, mutual incorporation. Asa, by contrast, uses the expression, I have rav, much. The word rav is related to the word ribui, meaning multiplicity, which leads to separation. Since each attribute is distinct and unique, the more they express their qualities, the greater the difference between them. Therefore, although there were 70 souls in the family of Yaakov, when the Torah speaks of his taking his family to Egypt, the singular form of the word soul, nefesh, is used to describe them. The singular is used because, as mentioned above, the realm of holiness is characterized by oneness. Thus, although Yaakov's family numbered 70, they were characterized by oneness. Similarly, even though there are 10 spheres comprising 3 intellectual attributes and 7 emotive attributes, these attributes are personified in the 70 descendants of Yaakov, who represent the 7 emotive attributes, each comprising 10 particular qualities, thus totaling 70, as is well known. The interrelation between the different qualities fuses them into a single entity. Therefore, the Torah refers to them using the singular, as mentioned above. They are nonetheless absolutely unified, as will be explained. So when we entered and when we left Egypt, Klal Yisrael, all of Israel, was considered to be one entity. That's how much together we were. On contrast, though Esau's family numbered only 6, not even 70 like Yaakov, when the Torah describes him taking his family to Seir, the plural souls is used, for they represent separation and divisiveness. They were not together as one, they were all separate entities. The contrast between the realm of holiness and the realm of klipa can be understood by explaining their sources. The spiritual worlds of Tikkun and Tohu, from which these realms respectively derive. Tohu, the spiritual source of Esav, is characterized by separation. Hence, Chassidus refers to the spheres of Tohu as separate branches. In Tohu, the Midos emotive attributes could not tolerate one another. Chesed, kindness, could not tolerate the trait of Gevurah, might, nor could Gevurah tolerate the trait of Chesed. As I was mentioning earlier, in the 10 spheros, when Hashem created the 10 spheros, it was different because the chaining down of the worlds was that it was able to exist because there was bitzel, there was room for other traits to exist amongst the other traits. As opposed to this, even one trait can't handle another trait. There's too much yeshes, there's too much selfishness. As will be explained, each attribute in the realm of Tohu shown with full force. Hence, it could not tolerate an attribute of a different nature. To use an example, there are certain people who see only their own point of view. They don't have the capacity to see another person's perspective. Thus, a person whose character tends to kindness will always look generously on others and have trouble seeing their faults. When another person points out the need for caution, the kind person may argue with him. Conversely, a person who is overly critical will object and argue with those who challenge his judgment and advocate leniency. Similarly, each of the attributes of Tohu could only express their nature and could not understand or tolerate a different quality. For this reason, a narrative in the Torah is not just a story of events that transpired in this world. It is a manifestation of spiritual reality, showing us what is happening in the spiritual realms above. All the stories of the Torah actually occurred, with all their details, in accord with the straightforward understanding of the biblical narrative. However, they also contain a spiritual meaning that reflects the makeup of the higher realms. Indeed, fundamentally, the Torah is a description of spiritual reality. That spiritual reality shapes the nature of our material existence to the extent that these truths manifest themselves in the events and situations in the material world. The Torah states that the kings of Edom, the physical counterparts of the attributes of Tohu, successively reigned and died. This reflects the well-known Kabbalistic concept of the shattering of the vessels of the realm of Tohu. Our sages state that God built worlds and destroyed them. In Chassidus, it is explained that this refers to the world of Tohu, chaos, which preceded our realm. The world of Tikkun, but which was destroyed in the spiritual cataclysm referred to as Shviras HaKelim, the breaking of the vessels. To explain, as the divine light and life energy began to flow downward to lower rung spheros. Divine attributes comprised of oros, lights, and kalim vessels came into existence. In the realm of Tohu, the oros were extremely intense and powerful. As a result, these attributes did not bond and interrelate with each other. They were absorbed in their own self-expression and cannot conceive of and had difficulty tolerating another attribute. This reduced their stability. Moreover, the kalim intended for these lights were insubstantial in nature. So it was basically a vessel that was too much of itself, and because it had too much light, the vessel crashed and shattered. Whereas in Spheros HaKelim, the vessels are yay big, however big they are. They may have much light, but it's just enough light that it's not too much. It's the right amount of light to sustain it and have room for others as well. Maybe there's just enough space in the vessel of its own quality that it can have part of all the other spheres included with it. Chesed would have part of Gevurah, Tiferes, Hod, Yesod, Malchus. Every sphere would have room for another sphere in the chaining down of the world, whereas in the Spheros HaKelim of Tohu, there was too much light that it would smash the vessels. Tikkun is like order, where everything's the right amount and right measure, and Tohu is chaos. So the Jewish people were considered in the realm of Tikkun, and the nations of the world are the opposite. The fundamental self-orientation and intolerance that led to the shattering also brought about the division that characterizes Klippa and the Sitra Achra. This constitutes the Klippa of Midian, an example, qualities of strife, contention, and separatedness. This is the result of the fall, that the shattering of Tohu. The Seder Hishtalshelus, spiritual cosmos, is characterized by a pattern of chain-like descent. The term chain-like is used because of all the levels are interconnected like the chains. What's all that noise?
Go.
Huh?
I'm cleaning. I'm not waiting on you. You can go in the bedroom if you want to do it. I need to finish this before I can go.
I think this whole video is nothing because of all that noise.
It's fine. You can't even hear it on the video.
I was just distracted. Okay. So we're talking about Spheros HaKelim in the realm of Tohu versus the realm of Tikkun. In Tohu, there's all this energy and all the vessels and of different characteristics of different emotions. And in Tohu, it's chaos. So because of its selfishness, because of there not being enough room for anything else besides its own ideas, its own light or whatever, there was too much light and it couldn't be contained within the vessel. Whereas Tikkun, the proper measure, in order, it was able to have room for the other ones. So the Klipa of Midian, by contrast, does not relate to a specific attribute. It does not represent any one attribute of Tohu, but rather the entire realm, which in general is characterized by separation and division. Midian refers to the fundamental characteristic of separation and defines the realm of Tohu as a whole. Hence, it is described as separate branches. This trend toward separation is the primary reason for the shattering of the vessels of Tohu. Through a chain of progressive descent, Heichaltzu. The term Heichaltzu refers to the chain-like scheme wherein the descent and progressive contraction of the divine light gives rise to the existence of increasingly more defined and limited realms of existence. To explain, the Kabbalists speak of spiritual worlds. To expound upon that concept by way of analogy, the term sweetness is applied in many different contexts. For example, food is described as being sweet. A melody is called sweet. A person referred to as sweet, and there's even to refer to a colloquial Yiddish expression, a zisa svara, a sweet concept. Now there are many levels within each of these categories themselves. There are multiple different types of sweet foods, songs, persons, and ideas. However, the difference between two types of sweet food is of a totally diverse nature than the diverse between sweet food and sweet song. The sweetness of both foods can be tasted by the palate, while the sweetness of a song requires the use of higher senses, and the sweetness of a person and an idea cannot be perceived by our physical senses at all. Nevertheless, the same term is used to describe all these four types of sweetness. In other words, the same motive can exist on different planes and in different forms, and the lower manifestation of the motive can be seen as an analogy for the higher one. A similar concept applies regarding the various levels of spiritual existence. As divine light and life energy descend from a higher to a lower plane, their multiple expressions take on different forms and manifestations. What distinguishes a lower plane from a higher one? The degree of self-awareness possessed by the created beings of that realm and the corresponding degree to which the godly light that shines in that realm is veiled. In that vein, Hasidus interprets the verse describing King Shlomo's wisdom. He related 3,000 analogies, explaining that King Shlomo would relate 3,000 analogies for every Torah concept. He would see and explain to others every Torah idea as it exists on 3,000 planes of existence. Each analogy he gave was a manifestation of the same concept on a lower level of existence. Since these levels of existence followed a pattern of progressive descent, they are considered as links in a chain. The above explanation is appropriate to describe Seder HaHishtalshelus as a whole. However, an additional explanation is necessary with regard to sparks of Tohu. The Seder Hishtalshelus as a whole is described as having undergone a chain-like descent. An example, the lower level shares a connection to the higher level. In contrast, the sparks of Tohu are described as having fallen. An example, their lowly state is not directly connected to their source. Accordingly, although the source for a lion on the physical plane is the angel identified with the face of the lion in Yechezkel's vision of the divine chariot, that source is a lofty level of holiness. By contrast, a lion on the physical plane is a non-kosher animal with cruel tendencies. The separation that characterized the realms of Tohu gave rise to the 7 evil and motive attributes. As mentioned, this separation is the general reason for the shattering of the vessels of Tohu. The Klipa of Midian in this world is an extension and result of the fundamental separation that characterized Tohu, and therefore is not included among the 7 nations, for it is not an individual quality, but rather represents the general condition of Tohu, which is division. So Midian is even worse. It's not representing one aspect of unholiness. It represents Tohu. It represents the whole concept of being separated. It's literally the root source, the cause of why all the other spheros can't be mixed with the other one. The quality of Tohu, chaos, is Midian, and it's generally the sole culmination of all of them put together. It's just horrible. It is not an effect of the shattering, but rather the root and source of the shattering. It is not that division resulted from shattering of the spheros of Tohu and their fall. Instead, in their very source, the spheros of Tohu were characterized by a thrust towards self-orientation. And the realm of Tohu itself, that self-orientation, was expressed in a desire to cling to God. However, after the shattering and the subsequent descent, that self-orientation was expressed in division and led to strife. As well as will be explained in the subsequent chapters, our divine service involves refining and transforming our 7 emotional qualities, and corresponding to the 7 Canaanite nations. Therefore, their lands were to be conquered and made part of Eretz Yisroel. The land of Midian was not to be conquered, for the general quality of self-orientation that leads to division and strife must be uprooted and eliminated entirely. It cannot be transformed into holiness. So the summary is, the Klipa of Midian is identified with strife and baseless hatred, like hating for no reason. The 7 Canaanite nations represents the 7 specific midos in the realm of Klipa. The chapter continues the discussion of the spiritual counterpart of Midian, the quality leading to strife and contention that exists within our hearts. It explains that Midian reflects the innate self-orientation that characterizes Klipa. This distinguishes the realm of Klipa from the realm of holiness. Holiness is characterized by bittul, self-nullification, which leads to unity. By contrast, Klipa is characterized by self-orientation, self-absorption, care mainly about yourself, which leads to separation and ultimately strife. So selfishness leads to division and conflict and strife. The chapter emphasizes the source for the self-orientation of Midian, the realm of Tohu. Although the spheres of Tohu were lofty spiritual powers, they were characterized by self-orientation. True, they represented a rung of holiness. However, because of the intensity of their light, they were fundamentally unstable. This brought about the spiritual cataclysm known as Spheros HaKalim, the breaking of the vessels after the Kalim of the Spheros of Tohu shattered. Their remnants underwent a radical descent that led to the Klipa of Midian, the quality that brings about the separation, strife, and contention that prevails in our world. And that concludes chapter 3.